Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webcast, Emotional Intelligence for Leaders, Leveraging EQI 2.0 Leadership to Develop Leadership Capability, sponsored by MHS, and presented today by Byrne. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that this webcast has been pre-approved for IHR certification credits, HRCI and SHRM credits. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast to receive your credits. You will receive an email from HR.com within 1 to 2 business days, which will include the certification credit information. Questions may be submitted anytime during the webcast by typing the question in the Ask a Question text field and clicking Submit the orange button located on your screen. And I will now turn it over to Byrne.
Thank you, Kathy. Hi, everyone. You're very welcome to the webinar. I say my name is Billy Byrne. I'm based in Dublin in Ireland, and I work as an executive coach and as a leadership development specialist with a company called Kinch Lyons. So before joining the company, I actually worked for 10 years in a number of senior management positions. And currently my work is, quite a lot of it is coaching of leaders across a broad range of industries. And more I've been drawn into emotional intelligence in practice, how we can use emotional intelligence, or EQ, to develop leadership capability in practical day-to-day situations. Just before I move on, I just say, if you have questions, by all means, raise them. I will try to answer them at the end rather than interrupt as I go along. So I will pick up your questions at the end. And any that I don't get to, I'd be more than happy to respond to separately. So to get going and looking at EQ and leadership, I'd like to put it first in the context, put emotional intelligence in the context of leadership. The Center for Creative Leadership, in a study of about 300 leaders and senior managers, found that 8 emotional intelligence elements predicted high leadership performance 80% of the time. So, gosh, what does that mean? What does it mean to us in practice for those of us involved in the area of leadership development? So what I want to share with you today is how we make practical linkages between emotional intelligence and leadership when we are developing leaders. So really, the linkages I want is a 3-way linkage I want to explore. I want to look at emotional intelligence, I want to look at leadership competencies, but also I want to look at leadership action, and that's the way I'm going to take us through the next hour or so. So I think it's important that we have a working definition of emotional intelligence, and I will use emotional intelligence and EQ interchangeably as we go through. But here's a definition, the one that I tend to go back to again and again. Emotional intelligence is a set of emotional and social skills that collectively influences the way we perceive and express ourselves, develop and maintain social relationships, cope with challenges, and use emotional information in an effective and meaningful way. So there's a lot of things there that we'll draw out. However, you will notice that I have highlighted the word collectively, and I've done that for a reason, because EQ is a set of skills that work together. And importantly, I think in the context of leadership, these are skills that leaders can develop, and can develop collectively rather than individually. So for coaches and those working in the area of leadership development, it's important to develop these EQ skills, not in isolation from the work context, but very much in the day-to-day work situation. So a skilled leader and an emotionally intelligent leader will use a wide range of emotional intelligence skills. And later in the webinar, we will take a look at 2 particular leadership situations and examine the role that emotional intelligence plays in those particular situations. I'm going to start by looking at the EQI 2.0 model, because I think it's important that we have a consistency in terms of terminology and definition as we go through. So I'm going to use the MHS model, which is the model I use in my own work, throughout the presentation. However, for some of you will be very familiar with it, others may not be so. So I will quickly introduce the model. So it's what we call, it's a 1-5-15 model. There's one overall emotional intelligence, which is that blue circle in the center of the model. There are 5 composite scales around the outer edge, and then each of those composite scales has 3 sub-scales. So there are 15 of these sub-scales. Briefly, I look at the composite scales, that outer edge of the circle. So the first, starting at the top, self-perception, our own inner world of emotions. So this describes how we assess our feelings of our own strength and inner strength and confidence, our persistence in the pursuit of personally relevant and meaningful goals, and also critically for leaders, understanding the what, the when, the why, and the how different emotions impact our thoughts and our actions. So that's really, really important. So when we look at that inner world, you can see the way it moves around a circle. If I move around to the next composite scale of self-expression, how do I now take those inner emotions and how do I action those into that inner world into the outer world? So this is about how I remain self-directed and openly expressive of my thoughts and feelings, and how do I communicate those feelings in a constructive, in a positive, and a socially acceptable way. Moving on again, using my emotions in the interpersonal zone, how I develop and maintain relationships, how I build trust and compassion, how I articulate, how I understand another person's perspective. You'll see the word empathy there, and this will be drawn out quite a lot through the rest of the webinar. But also how I act responsibly and show concern for others in my own social area, my team, but also maybe the broader social environment outside of work. Moving on then into that green, decision making. Again, emotions have an impact on our decisions we make, and we need to understand what that impact might be. So that's an ability to resist or delay impulses. You see the word impulse control there. Also remaining objective, avoiding rash behaviors, and also giving us more effective problem solving. And then finally, coming back around, let's say maybe coming back to the inner world again in blue, stress management, how well we cope with the emotions that are associated with change under familiar and unpredictable circumstances. Also remain hopeful about the future and resilient in the face of setbacks and obstacles. So I'm not going to go into it any more detail than that. And the language that we've used as we've gone around the model very quickly there, I will be drawing out that language throughout the rest of the presentation as we go through the webinar. So I'd like to bring you now to the knowing-doing gap. So when I work with managers, they're often already aware of competencies that they need to develop. So they may have received feedback during performance appraisals. They may have had feedback from peers. They may have actually identified some gaps as a result of attending a leadership development program or workshop. So they may have already identified areas of competence where they would like to work. However, they often need enablers to help them to develop these competencies. And this is where I really believe EQ has an enormous amount to offer right from day one in helping the leader to build competency. So the starting point is often competency. But when we get into developing the competency and wanting to build that competency quickly, now we can use emotional intelligence and use the emotional intelligence skills to develop new habits and new ways of working. And that's what we're about here today. I want to look again, as I said, I'm looking at the MHS EQI 2.0 emotional intelligence model. And particularly in the leadership report produced by MHS, it draws out 4 leadership dimensions or competencies in that report. So 4 competencies are identified that are associated with transformational leadership, and they're on your screen. The first, authenticity, the authentic leader serving as a role model for moral and fair behavior. Coaching, a leader who uses coaching to develop and mentor others. Insight, and that's about communicating a purpose and vision. And innovation, encouraging innovative thought and risk-taking. I will get into these in more detail in a few minutes because I really want to ground those, but that's just the overview and let you know where did I come up with those particular competencies to begin with. So if we take just at a high level, what are those 4 dimensions? The first, as I said, is authenticity. So this is about a competency. It's about transformational leadership and being an inspirational role model. Secondly, coaching is that operating as a mentor to the team and identifying individual needs and supporting development. Third, insight. That's about communicating a purpose and engaging others in that purpose or vision. And finally, innovation. And that's encouraging innovative thought and risk-taking. So even, I hope, if you were to dwell on those even for a moment as you look at them, you will see there are emotional, intelligent connections that are almost obvious ones before we even begin. But I'm going to draw all those out in the next few slides. Just to give you a little bit of insight as well, some of the research behind this, the NHS did some research with leaders who took the EQI 2.0 questionnaire and also did a leadership measure, which was closely matched to the 4 dimensions. And leaders scored significantly higher in EQ than the general population. So leaders have a higher bar in terms of emotional intelligence than, let's say, a general population sample. In total EQ would be about 14 points higher than for general population. But also, all of those 15 subscales were also higher individually for leaders, on average about 6 points higher than for the general population. So transformational leaders score very high in EQ than leaders who are more transactional. So that's what we're going to look at, transformational leadership, looking at these 4 competencies and seeing what goes to make them up. So I'm going to leave this slide on your screen for a few moments, and you can look around it as we talk. It's authenticity. It's the first leadership dimension that I mentioned. So let's look at how EQ links to this particular competency. So there are elements, and this is based on theory and research, the 6 elements that are shown around the outer rim, based on theory and research that are most closely associated with this competency. On this slide, I give you a little bit more insight. We do a little bit less on the rest. So let's have a look around it first. Where would we begin? Self-actualization. So how would that link? Well, it's about engaging, that pursuit of personally and relevant and meaningful objectives. Reality testing, recognizing when emotions or personal biases can make us less objective. Self-regard is about inner strength and confidence. Respecting oneself and understanding and be very much accepting of one's strengths and weaknesses. Emotional self-awareness, that ability to recognize and understand our own emotions and the impact on our own thoughts and actions. Social responsibility, that willing contribution to our social groups. And independence, being self-directed and free from emotional dependency. So let's just take 2 of these as examples and get a little bit more depth. So take someone who is striving to be a more authentic leader. So they may very well be conscious of their values. They may also be very conscious of how these align with their own organization. However, to be authentic with skill, they need to think about authentic leadership and not just authenticity. In other words, what skills does the leader need in order to be an inspirational role model? And I think that's the linkage we need to make between emotional intelligence and competencies. So I'm going to take 2 of these as an example. And I'm going to take, the first will be self-regard, of the 6 that are there, and I'll also look at emotional self-awareness as good examples to work with. So let's take self-regard. The leader who has developed a healthy level of self-regard can provide a great deal of transparency to their team. They are trusted leaders because of this. They have trust and they have built it over time. However, if they have a low level of self-regard, they can often revert to wearing an organizational mask that they hide behind. So if you think about it, how can you as an authentic leader expect others to accept you if you're not truly accepting of yourself? So the leader with a healthy self-regard is confident enough to admit mistakes, to acknowledge their own weaknesses and their strengths, and to see these weaknesses and development areas as opportunities for them to develop, and they're not afraid to move outside of their comfort zone. And this is also inspiring to the people that work with them, because they are also then challenged to grow and develop. This also links obviously to self-actualization and that drive to improve. The second one I look at is emotional self-awareness, and that's about being comfortable with and awareness of your own emotions and the triggers. What are those emotional triggers for you as an authentic leader? So leaders who are emotionally self-aware are less likely to be tripped up by their emotions, and they actually view emotions as important data. And developing themselves as an authentic leader, these leaders tend to develop great emotional self-awareness over time, and this is something that can be developed day by day, situation by situation. When coaching leaders, I regularly get them to form the habit of noticing and reflecting on their emotional reactions to both people and situations. And keeping even a daily or a weekly journal is a powerful way of developing this particular emotional intelligence skill. Next, look at coaching. I won't go in as much detail, but I'll still pick out a couple of the emotional intelligence areas which will contribute here. There are coaching skills and coaching models, but again, EQ can act as a means of applying these coaching skills in a more measured and a more skillful way and with greater impact. Again, you can see that there are 6 that are closely linked with its competency, and the 2 I'm going to choose, the first will be empathy, which won't be a surprise to you, I think. This is the ability to recognize, understand, and appreciate how other people feel, and also being able to articulate that understanding of another's perspective. So for the leader who decides they're going to adopt a coaching style, this is a key skill. It makes them a better coach and mentor to their team because it shifts the focus from them leader as expert to leader as facilitator. So empathy helps shift that focus to the other person and to the other person's unique perspective. I've also found that this actually provides the leader with additional insights themselves. So in developing this skill, I encourage leaders and I work with them to do 2 things. Firstly, use empathy to focus on questions rather than answers. So when dealing with and coaching with, say, a direct report, spend more time working on the question than on the solution. Don't be the expert. In other words, use open questions to help the other person to explore and then also summarize for them what you've heard. That summary can be extremely powerful. And I found in practice that it does 2 things. So in other words, you're acting as a coach, you're acting as a mentor, you're listening to what the particular topic that the other person or the problem they're grappling with, you're working with them, and you summarize what you've heard. It does 2 powerful things. The first thing, your summary lets the other person know that you have heard them, you've understood them, and listened well enough that you've actually been able to summarize back to them. So that's a huge in terms of building trust and building rapport. But secondly, by the very fact of summarizing back to the other person, you are providing them with a summary of their thoughts that they have never heard before. And this is a really fantastic skill, and it's a really fantastic gift to give back to someone, because in many cases, this summary that you give them will actually allow them to crystallize their thinking. So those are 2 things that when I'm working with leaders who want to develop empathy, particularly developing coaching, I get them to do those 2 things. Sorry, that first one, firstly, around the focusing on solutions. The second one, which is allied to it, is I get them to move from what I call questioning of to questioning with. In other words, move from a questioning of the other person to working collaboratively with the other person, and both of you working together to, in collaboration, question the content. So the shift here is very much from questioning the content rather than questioning the person, and really getting into a collaborative space. This also needs empathy, and doing this and practicing this develops empathy for the transformational leader. So that's empathy, can be developed. A few things there I've given you. The next one I look at from around related to coaching is assertiveness. Now, some of you might be surprised that assertiveness is included, firstly as an emotional intelligence skill in the first place, but also in relation to the competency of coaching. So why it's important in coaching is that, particularly the leader as coach and the manager as coach, using a coaching style, is that there is a need to hold other people accountable, but to do this skillfully and constructively. So as you can imagine, that skill must also be supported and by developing empathy. A skillful assertiveness requires also empathy skills. But again, working with a leader who is developing their coaching skills, skillful assertiveness and learning the assertiveness skill and not seeing assertiveness as a particular style, but seeing it as a range, is a very powerful development for any leader. Next, I move on to insight. It's another key leadership competency. It's often a potential challenge in terms of its development because it's about inspiring others, having that purpose and vision, and being able to share that vision. So it can be a challenge in terms of development. How do I do this, rather than make it a very superficial, let's say, about articulating and inspiring others, but to make it a real, authentic inspiration of other people. I'm going to pull out again 2 of the elements that are shown there by way of example. The first, interestingly, is self-actualization, which is which appears in all of the competencies, is a very powerful emotional intelligence skill that's required. This is about pursuing your own meaningful goals. So can you just imagine the challenge for the leader who is trying to inspire others if they themselves are not driven to pursue meaningful and challenging goals? So others will look to the standards that the leader sets for themselves, and this is what inspires them to do likewise. They aspire to be like the leader. So as you can probably gather, there are very strong linkages between insight and authenticity at a competency level. So the authentic leader who also has that authentic vision and that following a meaningful purpose and being able to inspire others. So together they are powerful leadership competencies. And both are enabled by developing self-actualization and self-regard. So when coaching leaders in this area, it's important for them to reflect on their own search for meaning, and also that they are able to skillfully articulate this passion in order to inspire others. So they need to be able to answer the question for themselves: why is this important to me? And this is important, I think, to explore with leaders, either in session, in coaching, or in group, in team sessions. The second piece I'll draw out here is interpersonal relationships. Now this is obviously key for a leader. It's all about relationships. And for the transformational leader, the ability to build and maintain strong relationships is key. I do believe we need to think of this in a 360-degree sense with leadership. It's in the context of one's own team, one's peers, leading upwards, and also leading and building relationship with stakeholders and customers. So as you might imagine, there are a range of EQ skills that come into play when building relationships. However, in my experience, those who are skilled in this area do two things really, really well. The first thing to do well is they are proactive rather than reactive. They actively set aside time to manage key relationships, and they never let them go stale. So it isn't just about networking and building relationships and working the room, let's say. It is about putting time in, knowing who my key relationships are, and regularly putting time into doing this. So taking a proactive role in interpersonal relationships and building and maintaining. The second thing that they do well, which is interesting, is that they don't treat relationships as a one-size-fits-all. They see each relationship as unique. So in order to inspire others, you need to connect emotionally with the other person. If you think about what motivation is, it is very much about emotions. And if you're trying to inspire and influence others, that emotional connection must tap into something in the other person. And whatever it is, that is inspirational for that person. So once again, this requires a level of empathy if one is to understand where the other person is coming from. And the fourth of the dimensions or competencies that we've taken out of the leadership report is innovation. One might be tempted to think that innovation has little to do with emotional intelligence. However, we are speaking in the context of leadership. So being a leader, an innovative leader who encourages innovation and autonomy, who welcomes challenge to the status quo and inspires others to take risk. So once again, certain EQ skills provide a means of developing this competency. So I'm going to take optimism as a really good example here, because it's a great enabler in this regard. We're not talking about rose-tinted glasses. We're talking about positive attitude and outlook coupled with that ability to rebound from setbacks. And when it comes to innovation, I'm sure as many of you would testify to, you have to be able to deal with setbacks and learn from these. For every successful innovation, there will be many failed attempts. So even the best plans meet with unexpected obstacles that need to be overcome. And in my experience, the innovative leader is optimistic in two key aspects. The first is they have a can-do attitude. And what I mean in an emotional intelligence sense is they demonstrate enthusiasm. And this requires very, very well-developed emotional self-expression. So they're in touch with their emotions, but they are skillfully able to express that as a can-do attitude in terms of motivating others. That's the first thing that they do. The second one is that they demonstrate perseverance in the face of setbacks. But interesting, what they do is they're very aware that they're doing this and they share it. So they don't try to say there aren't any problems. They acknowledge the challenges, they articulate the challenges, and then they show and demonstrate their own commitment to addressing those. So others are not afraid to articulate their concerns, but also see this as something normal to do, but also say, I can articulate my concerns, but ultimately I'm going to deliver this, we're going to make this work. So they do both of these things with skill. So cultivating optimism in terms of innovation is about cultivating a way of viewing. So as the saying goes, changing the viewing changes the doing. So in other words, the way I view something will change the way I approach it and the way I work with it. So when working with leaders in a development context, this is an area that benefits greatly from development in tandem with developing emotional self-awareness and working with the client to tune into their reactions to things like risk, to setbacks, and also to success. And then to work with them on using this emotional information when they engage with others and to shape that interaction that they have with other people. So when we put it all together, you can see that we've got a range of leadership competencies. I've just taken a few examples. It isn't a formula. When working with a particular leader, the leadership competencies and the EQ skills need to be put in context. So if a particular leader who wants to develop a certain leadership competencies, the EQ skills that will most benefit them will emerge through coaching. So let's take this now and bring it into leadership action and move to another level. So I'm going to take two examples. I'm going to take a relatively straightforward, I won't say simple, example, a straightforward example of conflict management. Conflict management is not simple, but it certainly is relatively straightforward. And then we look at a more complex area of leading change. And in both examples, what I'll try to do is identify the emotional intelligence skills that the leader can draw upon in order to deliver better organizational outcomes. If we first take conflict management, two possibilities arise. The first, the leader may themselves be in conflict with others. And secondly, the leader may be just endeavoring to manage the conflict between others, so they may or may not be involved. However, conflict by its nature is emotionally charged, so regardless of which situation the leader is in, it's important that the leader first manages themselves. And that is the first key. How do I manage myself in conflict? What effect is conflict having on me? So I've picked out five, I beg your pardon, emotional intelligence skills that the leader can draw on in terms of how do I manage myself in conflict. So emotional self-awareness in terms of my own emotional reactions to conflict. How do I express emotions when I'm in conflict? Emotional expression, my impulse control, particularly in emotionally charged situations, and my approach to problem solving when looking at conflict, and also stress. I mean, how I react from a stress point of view when in conflict. So that's how I manage myself. But then once I've got a grip on myself, let's say, I need to look at how do I manage others. And we must do it in this sequence. We must manage ourselves first, and then we must manage others. So again, there are things I need to look at here. I need to understand, use empathy to understand both sides of the conflict. Any of you who work in the area of conflict know the power of empathy in terms of trying to find solutions. The other thing is assertiveness. I need to have the skills to stand up for what I believe in and to do it in a non-offensive manner. I also need to manage relationships through the conflict and out the other end and take a long-term view. I also need to bring my problem solving to another level. And I also need to use optimism because sometimes in conflict it looks like there can be no way out. And if you think of take conflict to a world level, I'm sure lots of people who have sat in rooms looking at conflict says there is no way out of this. Optimism is required if we are to have that attitude of coming back from setbacks and coming up with innovative solutions. So some questions I need to ask myself, or if I'm working with a leader, getting the leader, working with the leader, and both of us asking these questions. So what is my own emotional reaction to conflict? In other words, where am I in all of this? Secondly, what emotions do I express when I'm in conflict and managing conflict? Sometimes I may have exaggerated emotions or I may suppress emotions, but what's going on for me when that's happening? This builds on very much on emotional self-awareness. I need to be aware of how my emotions are expressed and be able to do this with more skill. Also, how does this affect my decision-making? Do I make decisions differently when I'm in conflict? Am I more rash? Do I avoid decisions? Am I more easily swayed by emotional argument? And then finally, how do I experience stress? Am I aware of it? And how do I manage it? Are there particular things I do to manage stress that I don't normally use in other situations, and how might I use them here? So these are all questions that can be explored with a leader, and it's a lot of self-awareness comes from even asking of these questions. And then moving on to asking the questions of how do I manage others? How do I use empathy to understand others? And also, how do I use empathy to make sure they know that they've been heard? That they've been understood, that someone has listened to them, so that I can then perhaps move towards resolution. Or if I can't get resolution, at least be able to manage the conflict. How do I maintain relationships? And how do I do this proactively? I used the word proactive earlier. I think that's really important. To proactively manage relationships. How do I ensure that the relationship is maintained? Because I do need to manage that for the longer term. How do I use assertiveness in conflict? How uncomfortable or comfortable am I in being assertive? And then finally, what role can I bring optimism and problem solving to help me find innovative solutions? So that's a straightforward look, let's say, at emotional intelligence in action, particularly for the transformational leader, drawing on those competencies. But let's look at a more complex one. Let's look at leading change. Obviously, leading change tends to be over a longer period of time, tends to be more complex, tends to be less straightforward, could be very high stakes, and there are a number of competencies that could be associated. All competencies could be associated with leading change. I've drawn out two for this example. I've taken authenticity, because I think the authentic leader is going to be a transformational leader, is the one who is going to be able to build rapport, build trust, and effectively drive true change. So I want to take out a few of the emotional intelligence skills that are required. The first being self-actualization. And if you are thinking about someone leading a change project in terms of authenticity and innovation, have in the back of your mind maybe something like the Kotter 8-step model. Even as we go through, as I'm talking through the next few slides, just think about things like what would be the 8-step model, how might that play out? Because authenticity, a person leading a change program needs to be trusted. They need to have the confidence of their team. Not all the decisions will be popular ones. The change program will meet obstacles. So the authentic leader does need to be a role model for the team, inspiring confidence and being fair and even-handed. But also they need to be innovative, because as we know, change is never as rational or as straightforward as some of the textbooks might lead us to believe. It needs constant recalibration, constant adjustment along the way. And the innovative leader spots opportunities, takes risks, and also inspires others to find those solutions. So, taking self-actualization, where would this have a role to play in leading change? So, the transformational leader firstly draws on their own personal drive and energy to influence others, so that they can communicate that authentic passion and enthusiasm. So in particular, this is an important skill when forming your guiding coalition for change, when you're at the beginning and you're starting off in your change program, but also when you're trying to communicate that vision onwards. So self-actualization is also important in terms of encouraging innovation, for example, when creating early wins. But as you can see, having that drive, that personal drive, is important right through the change project, the change program. If I then take independence, it's related to both authenticity and innovation, about being confident, being decisive, and that's critical during change. Sometimes tough decisions have to be made, and the change agent or the leader's change agent may have to make key decisions with limited information. And with tight timelines. So gauging the right level of independence is an important emotional intelligence skill for leaders. In other words, getting the balance between collaboration and independence. So in terms of change, this comes into its own when we get to empowering others to act on our vision. Thirdly, optimism. It has come up quite a bit already, but in a change program, optimism, change is never smooth. There are always setbacks. So important for the leader not just to deal with this herself, but also to inspire others who will watch how the leader reacts to these setbacks. So during the toughest moments of a change program, the leader is very much in the spotlight. And in my experience, those who have a healthy level of optimism deal with ambiguity better than those who are pessimistic. This is because Change programs go through these stages of uncertainty and ambiguity, and during these periods, there are enormous pressures from stakeholders to maybe settle for less or to declare success even though we haven't actually got there. The optimistic leader who is really transformational continues to strive to achieve the goal, and they're not put off that. They're assisted by their own self-actualization also, whereas the less optimistic leader tends to become more risk-averse and may settle for a lesser goal. Problem solving. This is related to innovation. The intelligent or the emotional intelligent leader strikes a balance between this systematic problem solving and also using emotional information or gut instinct. In my experience, it's never one or the other. The skilled leader and the transformation leader uses a mix of logic and intuition. But this is a well-informed gut instinct and well-informed intuition. It's based on knowledge and experience that has been laid down over many years. And this is really important for engaging and enabling the organization. And finally, empathy. Coming back to empathy appears always in terms of leadership. It's needed by the leader because it's such an important basic EQ skill. So getting to understand how others are experiencing change, it requires the leader to suspend their judgment and to see the situation from the other person's perspective. So the other person really needs to feel that the leader genuinely understands them and is genuinely interested in their feelings and perceptions. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of leading change, and you could go into all of the emotional intelligence areas and also all of the competencies. Just to give you a flavor, as I said, it isn't meant to be formulaic. I would like to spend a little time, though, on maybe some of the downsides, the derailment risk, some things that low emotional intelligence, linkages between having lower level development of emotional intelligence and the increased risk of derailment. So we're going to look at a few things. Firstly, that link between low emotional intelligence and the risk of derailing. Secondly, this risk, we don't often talk about it, but the risk of overusing a strength. And then also potential strategies to increase emotional intelligence in these areas. And I'll give you some of those which are good takeaways, I think. So again, going back to the leadership report from MHS, 4 emotional intelligence areas have been identified as contributing to increased risk of derailment. These are impulse control, which is associated with decision making, stress tolerance, which is associated with stress management, problem solving, which is also associated with decision making, and independence, which is related to interpersonal. So I look at each of these next slides, but what I want to draw out for you here is that how self-awareness is key to each of these. So if you're ever working with someone on any of these derailers, working on emotional self-awareness is absolutely key to working and moving a person away from this derailment risk. So I'm going to take a graphic. I've put emotional self-awareness in the middle because it's so important, and I look at the 4 areas first that are related to increased derailment risk. Impulse control. So if you've got low impulse control, this can have a direct and a negative impact on decision making, which is a key capability for leaders. So it can vary from the, let's say, the explosive boss who always seems to act irrationally when certain triggers arise, the amygdala hijack. But it can also be the more subtle but equally damaging leader who can be easily swayed and neglects to take the time to think things through. So maybe they're also not using enough reality testing. So low impulse control can certainly be an increased derailment risk. Secondly, stress tolerance. Being a leader means being in a situation that's potentially very stressful at times. So during successful times is very different than being a leader during, let's say, during a downturn. And I've seen leaders who have flourished during difficult situations, but also I've seen others who could not find the internal resources to cope with difficult situations. So others are looking at the leaders, particularly during tough times, during difficult situations, to see how they react. So it can be very much a career derailer as to how we operate as leaders when we're under severe pressure. Problem solving. There are very few problems that don't have an emotional content. When you think about it, very few situations don't have people involved. So immediately there's a potential for have emotional content. So as a minimum, the leader himself is involved in solving the problem, so there's going to be some emotion there anyway, an emotional connection. So failing to recognize the role that emotions have and are playing in our problem solving can lead to poor decision making, and poor decision making is a potential derailer. And finally, independence. The leader who lacks emotional intelligence in independence does face a real challenge. If this is at a very low level, one has a leader who is uncertain, appears indecisive, lets others make decisions, and is actually even uncertain of their own ideas. So they find it difficult to motivate and inspire others. So all of these require emotional self-awareness to be developed. And that's why I've shown it this way in the graphic. So in each case, we need to identify emotional triggers and situations when that trigger, let's say, some of these particular emotional intelligence skills. So I'm going to look at the overuse of a strength, which is the second piece. Not looked at maybe quite as often as underdevelopment, but overuse of a strength needs to be examined very quickly. Impulse control, that lack of spontaneity in terms of what does it look like. If you have a very high level of impulse control, it can be overused because it shows that you can miss opportunities and not listening to the well-informed gut decision, which is sometimes needed. Some people would say a good decision now is better than a great decision that is given too late. Stress tolerance, we would say rightly so. Having a very high level of stress tolerance is quite positive for the individual, but we need to bring this into a leadership context and to look at the potential impact of this on the team. So let's take a leader who's in a difficult situation and they're dealing with a stressful situation very, very well. What if they don't take into account how others are reacting and dealing with the situation? The leader can appear aloof, they can appear uncaring, and they can feel as if they're out of touch. So the emotionally intelligent leader who is very high on stress tolerance still needs to tap into their empathy and into their emotional awareness and to their emotional self-expression in terms of demonstrating to the other people where they are in the situation themselves, what stresses they're feeling, openly talking about these things, but also showing what they're doing to address their own stressful situations. So that's high stress tolerance. Problem solving, again, the challenge here is not to rely too heavily on one's own problem solving. If you're very, very skilled, there's a risk of not involving others where there might actually be value, not just in the potential to get a better solution, but also to get the buy-in and a shared understanding. So again, I think it's a case of balancing this with skill with balance, with maintaining relationships and seeing the value of relationships, not just the problem needs to be resolved, but also by involving others, I will be able to potentially come with a better solution, but also I will be able to involve them, get them on the same page, and also share knowledge with them. And finally, independence. It's a key strength for leaders, and obviously one that if it's underdeveloped, as I said, it can be a very huge contributor to derailment risk. However, if it's not balanced well with interpersonal relationships and reality testing, it can mean that the leader becomes very isolated in that they are so independent that they're making all of the decisions themselves and that they are not keeping other people, bringing other people with them, which is important as we go back to something like a change program. Or the leader's change agent. So once again, emotional self-awareness is always needed in recognizing and looking out for either underuse or overuse of a particular emotional intelligence area. So using emotional intelligence, even if it's highly developed, is not just about getting it to a high level and operating at that level all the time. It's about being able to apply it across a range of situations and being able to calibrate accordingly. So even something like problem solving, being able to arrange, depending on the situation, to be able to use that highly developed emotional intelligence skill appropriately and do that with skill. That's why it's important to go back again to emotional self-awareness. If I was to look then at, okay, I'm working with a leader and we're working on some of these derailers, and really we're going to start with increasing self-awareness. What type of conversations and what kind of questions might we explore when working with that leader in their development? So I'm going to give you a few suggestions that you can use. Firstly, take impulse control. So the leader needs to identify the conditions when they are more impulsive. So I'm going to talk here about when they are not able to manage their impulses. So they need to identify the triggers, and then they can take steps to open up a space between the whatever is the trigger and the response, because that's what leaders are expected to do. They don't get hijacked by their emotions. When something triggers, they're able to open up a space and choose a response rather than have an automated response. So questions you might ask are, okay, what are the conditions that I am more impulsive? For example, is it when I'm under pressure? Do I find myself more impulsive under certain pressure situations? And what types of pressures are those? Is it when I'm more pressurized at home? Is it more when I'm pressurized from senior management? Is it more pressurized from time? What are the things that cause me to have less impulse control? Secondly, time of day. This can be an interesting one, working with managers to get them to think about it. Are they more rational in their decision making at certain times of the day? And I found that it often is the case, that managers sometimes would be better to leave a decision to be made, maybe to leave certain decisions to be later in the day or make the decisions earlier in the day, but certainly people make better decisions at different times of the day. Also, is there a person or persons who trigger certain impulses, emotional triggers in me? So again, I need to be aware, are there certain people or are there certain environments or situations? So for example, are there maybe certain meetings where I find it a big challenge to manage my impulses, where I certainly don't find it in other situations? So again, raising the emotional self-awareness as to what the triggers are will allow me to spot the trigger, be able to then have a more considered response and be able to work on my impulse control. Stress tolerance. Increasing self-awareness here is twofold. The first is I need to be aware that I am becoming stressed at the earliest stage, and looking for the physiological signs when I feel that I'm becoming stressed, rather than have it build up and suddenly explode, to know that I'm becoming stressed. And it could be the typical, maybe heartbeat increased, maybe perspiration, or a lot of people say they just feel something in their gut, they feel something in their stomach. So again, firstly, being aware of, yes, I can feel that something is impacting on my stress level. And then knowing what those stressors are. So what is it that's triggering? And it's very much back to some of the things on impulse control again, certain people, certain situations, certain pressures. Certain conditions cause this. I then ask myself, what are my responses? So what do I do to manage my stress? And this is the important question. So what is my mechanism for dealing with it? And I need to have a range of tools here depending on the type of situation. So again, this can be something which is developed with the leader in terms of managing stress tolerance. Independence is a great one. I have to work with leaders quite a bit on this at times. And it's a very easy one from a journaling point of view in terms of raising self-awareness, is to get the leader that you're working with, or if you're working with a leader in development or coaching, to keep a weekly track of the key decisions they make, literally in 3 columns. So column 1, decisions I made completely independently. Column 2, decisions where I consulted widely, but then ultimately made a decision myself. And column 3, where maybe I consulted, maybe not, but I actually deferred the decision to someone else. So there are 3 columns. And the question then at the reflection is, when I look at those columns, I ask myself 2 key questions. The first is, am I getting the right balance here? When I look at these in the cold light of day, have I got the right balance between independent decision-making, collaborative decision-making, and deferral? And does it look right? But the second one is also, are there patterns here? Are there certain issues where I seem to defer more? Are there certain people where I seem to defer more? What is it? So I look for patterns and I look for the balance. And that's a great piece of self-awareness also. And then finally, problem solving. Again, looking at the problems addressed during the week. And a bit different than decision and independence, what I'm looking for here is to identify what was the emotional content of those problems that I was solving. So not only in myself, but also in others. And then did that emotion have a role to play? So there's a great learning here for anyone who's working on their own development as a leader, not just around derailing, but overall, just getting in touch with, when I'm dealing with decisions and problem solving, what emotions are involved. You can almost play it as a game. At meetings, what emotions am I picking up around here? What role are they playing? Where are my emotions in this? So again, there can be positive emotions, there can be negative emotions, but again, tuning into what those emotions are is really important. So really, and throughout the presentation, coming to the end, and we can take questions if you like, but it is all about balance, and I hope that has come across, because emotional intelligence, when you link it to competencies, it's rarely you can say, well, this particular emotional intelligence skill and this particular competency, yes, I developed this, will help me in that competency, but it's rarely a one-to-one. You've got to look at other areas as well. So balancing, as I said, for example, assertiveness. The person who is developing assertiveness should also be, for example, developing empathy, so that they can be assertive with more skill. They might also develop emotional self-awareness, because they want to be more self-aware around what's going on with them. So it is about balance. And it is about, when working with leaders, in having that balance and looking for those connections. As I said, it isn't meant to be a formula. It is very much meant to be an exploration with a person, the particular leader, with their particular challenges in their particular organization, and that's the approach that I take. So in summary, a few things. So firstly, emotional intelligence is linked to critical leadership competencies. I think we've seen that, and this comes through very clearly in the MHS EQI 2.0 leadership report, that linkage between transformational leadership and emotional intelligence. Secondly, EQ is a key enabler in bridging this knowing-doing gap. So many leaders will start from a competency point of view. It's competencies that they are interested in developing, but really the enabler that helps them to develop that competency, emotional intelligence, has a huge role to play there. Thirdly, there's a direct application to leadership challenges. I took conflict management and also leading change. But again, with working with leaders, there are so many leadership challenges, leadership situations that you can work with to see where would emotional intelligence as a skill, coupled with developing a competency, connect into leadership action. And then finally, as we've noticed, low EQ can actually increase that derailment risk. But it can be identified and it can actually be addressed. So, and be addressed very, very successfully and almost from day one. And starting, as I said, very much with increased emotional self-awareness. So that is a summary of where we've come through. I said, I'll take questions here, but also I'm happy if you want to contact me directly. I can give you my email address now and you can send questions to me. I'm more than happy for you to do that. My email address is Billy, B-I-L-L-Y, at kinchlyons, that's KINCHLYONS.IE. So Billy at kinchlyons.ie, and that will get me directly. So I'm just going to see, are there any questions? Mostly about the, are we going to get the copy? Yes, you will be getting a copy of the presentation. I'll just pick a question here, sorry. In a new leadership position, how do you start using EQ education and coaching? People tend to be skeptical with a new boss. Very good comment, that is the case. Trying to make the case for emotional intelligence, I think, particularly with in a new leadership position, is to tie it into competencies. Because just going in and going with the benefits of EQ directly is not it can be quite a challenge. Now, there's quite a lot of research on emotional intelligence out there, and ongoing research still going on currently. But I would say if I'm positioning this with a new boss around EQ, education coaching, is I would actually sit down and do an emotional intelligence session with the actual boss themselves, and get them to see the benefit of it, and very much link it into their own leadership competencies that they might be working on, and also into their work situation. So I hope that that answered the question there. Again, someone just asked, so during a stressful situation, I can feel getting flustered. What suggestions do you have so I can avoid that feeling? Well, that's the case. Firstly is to identify, I would say, a stressful situation. Not every situation, obviously, is causing you to get flushed. So to identify what the particular situation is, that's, again, emotional self-awareness. And then also to question yourself as to if that is the stressor. What do I feel? What sense am I making of this? Why am I adding some value to this particular stressful situation? What am I interpreting? And how could I interpret it differently? So that would be an answer there. There's quite a few other questions. Sorry, how can I, sorry, I'm trying to read. How can I apply this knowledge practically? I think if again, you'll have a PDF of the slides. I think you apply it practically in an organization situation is, firstly, you've got to get buy-in at the top. You've got to get people to believe in it. You then got to identify what is the underlying need. It's not that it's a solution for everything. You've got to say, well, what is the actual issue that we're trying to address here in this particular situation? So is it, relationship difficulties during change? Is it a restructuring? Is it maybe a particular team who are having difficulties working together? What is the actual underlying reason that emotional intelligence is even being looked at in the first place? And then to shape, well, okay, how can emotional intelligence play a role in this? And that's something that you have to do as, let's say, the leadership specialist, let's say if you're working as a leadership specialist. But not to have it as this is going to solve all your problems. Firstly, identify what the actual problem you're trying to solve, and then also try to identify how emotional intelligence linking to competencies and linking to leadership action. So I won't be able to take any more questions. I'm going to hand back to Kathy at the start, and hand back there, and I will be happy to take those questions. And if you want to email me any questions, I say it's billy@kinchlyons, KINCHLYONS.IE. So can I hand back to you, please, Kathy?
Yes, thank you so much, Billy, for presenting this very informative webcast today. There were a lot of questions about the slides, so a PDF presentation of this webcast is available on the HR.com site within 24 hours. You will receive an email from HR.com with the certification credit information within 1 to 2 business days. And MHS and HR.com do appreciate your feedback, so please take a moment at the very end of the webcast to complete the evaluation survey, which will appear on your screen. This concludes our webcast, and thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.